All right, hello and welcome to the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority's first of three webinars introducing Coyote Valley and the upcoming master plan for the valley's protected lands. My name is Nick Perry and I'm the Coyote Valley Project Manager for the Open Space Authority. I'm very excited to be here today as your host for this webinar, A Bird's Eye View of Coyote Valley. We have a great lineup of speakers today, but before we begin, I'd like to start with a bit of context for those of you less familiar with Coyote Valley. This view, looking west, shows Coyote Valley's remarkable setting, located at the narrowest point between the Santa Cruz Mountains, visible at the top of this photo, and the Diablo Range on the bottom of this photo. Coyote Valley serves as an essential landscape linkage, providing wildlife connectivity to over 1.1 million acres of critical habitat in these mountain ranges. The valley floor itself is home to an incredibly valuable wildlife habitat such as wetlands, creeks, and meadows, and is also home to rich agricultural lands, critically important water resources, and great opportunities for expanded public access to open space. Since 2019, the authority and its partners, the Peninsula Open Space Trust and the city of San Jose, have conserved nearly 1,400 acres of land in North and Mid Coyote Valley. These conserved lands are highlighted in green with gold outlines on this image. The long-term vision is to protect Coyote Valley for all, forever. And the upcoming master planning process will provide opportunities for communities to work together to create a roadmap for the future of these conserved lands. I'll be sharing more information about the master plan at our third webinar, but today's webinar is all about the amazing wildlife found throughout Coyote Valley. Each of today's speakers will share different perspectives and information on wildlife in the valley through short presentations followed by questions and answers. So while they're presenting, please feel free to pop any questions that come into mind to Zoom's Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. Before we welcome our first live speaker, we'd like to share a short video message from Walter Moore, the president of the Peninsula Open Space Trust, aka POST. So we'll get that video going for you right now.
My name is Walter Moore. I'm president of the Peninsula Open Space Trust, and I'm thrilled to introduce the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority's webinar called Bird's Eye View of Coyote Valley. You know, we spent our over 40-year history protecting many of the beautiful lands along the San Francisco Peninsula, but there is a big concern and issue about the peninsula, and that is it's a bottleneck. And so wildlife can get caught and lose their biodiversity if they're not able to link to other areas. And so we realized a day came probably over a decade ago when we were looking down in this area, and we realized the last of the undeveloped flats of Silicon Valley, which used to be called the Valley of Heart's Delight, right here in Coyote Valley. And so we knew we had a moment in time to take one last-ditch effort to protect this corridor between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Mount Diablo Range to make sure we had this genetic diversity linkage that we absolutely needed. When I come back here in 25 years and I'm still healthy and hearty and hiking around, it's what I'll see. And what I'll see are more magpies, more golden eagles, more of all the incredible snakes and other population we have. The mountain lions will be healthy. It will just be fabulous. It will be a place that people will come to for safaris on the edge of the 10th largest city in the United States. So it will be a place that will be attracting people and wildlife, and just a glorious place to be in.
We're very grateful for the many partnerships that make our work possible, including organizations like POST, who help us conserve natural and working lands and restore landscapes for both people and wildlife. And today we're hoping to introduce you to the wildlife of Coyote Valley and the important role this landscape plays in their lives. To start us off, it's my pleasure to introduce Neal Sharma, the Wildlife Linkages Program Manager for POST. Neal's going to show us some slides, and then we hope to do a little bit of Q&A. We realize the Q&A function is currently not working, and our team was working behind the scenes to turn that on for you all, so please bear with us. But with that, let me turn it over to Neal and welcome him to join us today.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everybody for being here today. As Nick mentioned, my name is Neal Sharma with Peninsula Open Space Trust, and my job today is to provide a brief overview of what makes Coyote Valley such a special place for wildlife, and to tie that to how the Coyote Valley planning process will pull all the information we have together to identify projects and approaches so we can best support biodiversity and ecosystem health, both in the valley floor and more broadly throughout the region. So we go to the next slide, please. Okay, starting us out, here we have a snapshot of some of the wildlife living in and passing through Coyote Valley. And what I love about this is how it represents such an amazing diversity of life. So these are animals that rely on this place. It's a place that's been identified as one of the 6 most important landscapes for conservation in the United States. And Coyote Valley, along with the rest of the Bay Area, has been recognized as a biodiversity hotspot of global significance. So that term biodiversity hotspot, that's really getting at 2 key elements. It's getting at species richness, meaning there are a lot of species here, including some that are only found in this place. And on the other hand, this is a setting that has experienced a substantial amount of habitat loss. So it's got that richness and that pressure, making it a biodiversity hotspot. Valley floor habitat in particular has been almost entirely converted permanently to other uses. So it's a particularly precious resource. Next slide, please. All right, so looking down for above, we're just using a basic aerial image as a guide today. And just looking at the aerial, we can see that contrast between the large areas of habitat in the Santa Cruz Mountains to the west, so that's on the left side of the screen, the Diablos to the east on the right side of the screen. So contrasting that with the urban areas. And then we have Coyote Valley circled in that yellow-orange color. And that's what we see as that last chance landscape that's preventing the isolation of those large areas of habitat. Is when ecosystems become isolated, we know that things start to unravel, and that's what we need to avoid and prevent here. Next slide, please. And so we'll zoom out just a bit further and focus in on that connective value, because that is what, it's a huge element of what makes Coyote Valley so special and irreplaceable as a last chance landscape. Next slide, please. Just spend a few moments here talking about the idea of connectivity, what it is, why it's so important. Connectivity can be described as the safety net of nature or the life support system for nature. And what it is it's that principle that is so important to allow species to meet their different needs, which look quite different as we'll get into in just a moment here. But broadly speaking, it's needed so that different animals can find habitat or the mates they need to reestablish following events like wildfire or disease, or to gradually shift their ranges over generations potentially in response to changing climate conditions. So it's this fundamental thread for healthy and resilient ecosystems. And I like to think of connectivity in a sense as the embodiment of ecology, because it's all about interrelationships and systems. And so as important as it is for us to think about the needs of individual species, we also think of it as a system and a community of interrelated parts and participants. And so that's an important lens for us to employ when we're looking at this landscape and think about the needs of today and also looking into the future and how we can best support this system to adapt to change. And so the planning process is a really important element that will identify those specific opportunities and needs on the landscape here. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit of time here on a series of vignettes of some very different animals, really to explore the idea of how connectivity looks different to different species and how it's important for us to be mindful of that complexity. So here we have on the screen, this is a puma or a mountain lion or a cougar or any number of other names. They are all applying to the same animal, but this is the apex predator that we have in the region. We know that apex predators are crucially important for healthy ecosystems. We also know that the Santa Cruz Mountains population, and potentially in the part of the Diablos as well, are isolated, meaning they're not able to, at least to the degree that they need to exchange genes through reproduction with each other. And so what happens with a population that we're seeing here is the effects of inbreeding, which can lead to the loss of genetic diversity and negative effects on the health of the population. So if we don't solve this problem, we could be looking at local extinction. If the top predator is lost, then what we've seen in other situations is that causes an imbalance in the system that cascades further if it were to take place. So among other things, that's what we're working to prevent and have a great opportunity here in Coyote Valley to work on that issue. Next slide, please. Okay, here we get an up close look at the California tiger salamander. And if we go straight to the next slide, please. So this is an animal that's born in a pond and goes through a metamorphosis. So we have one that's going through, on the previous slide, we saw an adult. And then on the right-hand side here, this is a photo of an animal, of a California tiger salamander that was just taken earlier this year, going through metamorphosis. And then once it completes this process, it leaves the pond and goes to the uplands where it spends its adult life in rodent burrows. And then it eventually returns to its birth pond and reproduces and continues the cycle. And so this is an animal that's experienced pressure from habitat loss, introduced predators, it's sensitive to pollutants, rodent suppression. So what happens when rodents are taken out of the landscape? Well, there are going to be fewer burrows that this animal is going to rely on in its adult life. So starting to see those interrelationships. And then not to mention other features in the landscape. You know, I like to think about a curb, which a mountain lion, where we visited previously, could step right over that, no problem. But a curb starts to look a lot like a wall when you're the size of a salamander. So just thinking about those features, and as we're planning for how to restore habitats and make sure these are connected features in the landscape. And there's a really promising intersection between habitat restoration for aquatic and riparian species here, and some of these broader sustainable water resource management strategies that we're collectively working on, that I think will be covered in one of the upcoming webinar series. Next slide, please. And then here we have the Western burrowing owl. And I'm not going to try to take too much thunder here. I know we have the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory here. I'd love to hear more from them on this species, but this is an animal that needs low vegetation. It's also experienced a lot of habitat loss. In addition to low vegetation, it needs safe refuge away from tall trees where predators might be perching. It needs healthy ground squirrel populations, which can contribute to the burrow network that the burrowing owls will use. So this is unfortunately a species that's in extremely steep decline in this area. And Coyote Valley presents opportunities to support recovery efforts. So it's a brief visit to three very different animals intended to illustrate the remarkable diversity of wildlife in Coyote Valley. And so as we get into the planning process, one of those key elements is to bring together the best knowledge on all these different species, the habitats, and the ecosystem overall in order to design the restoration that'll address the pressures the wildlife are facing. Next slide, please. So now we're going to step back to look at the landscape itself and some of the habitat conditions out there. It's quite varied, heterogeneous landscape. So here we're looking at an image taken at the Coyote Valley Open Space Preserve. Great habitat. It's some beautiful serpentine plant communities here in the foreground. Also looking at open meadows and oak woodlands. Next slide. But at the landscape as a whole, yeah, we're seeing quite a variety of conditions. So habitat that's been converted for use in more intensive agriculture. There's some residential uses in Coyote Valley, and then roads are a feature that's quite prominent across the landscape, looking from one mountain range to the next. If we could go to the next, please. So this is a map that's showing the movement of 26 bobcats that were fitted temporarily with GPS collars. This is work that we did with UC Santa Cruz and a firm called Pathways for Wildlife. And each color here represents an individual bobcat. And what this showed for us is highlighting the areas of the valley floor with the most intact habitat, really covering quite a variety from riparian habitats in Coyote Creek to the oak woodlands and meadows when we look at across the valley floor. So highlighting those areas of the most intact habitat, and also telling us quite a bit about wildlife and roads in Coyote Valley. And that's a continuing area of study as we try to figure out how we should best create permeability across those features, meaning creating safe places for passage, reducing wildlife collisions, roadkill, and the sort. So if we go to the next slide, and actually, if you wouldn't mind, please just clicking one more. So one of the things that this study contributed to, as well as some previous work, was identifying Monterey Road as a roadkill hotspot. And so that's what we have highlighted here is Monterey Road. Roadkill hotspot, important wildlife crossing area, particularly in between Bailey and Metcalf, which is directly adjacent to that crucial area that had been protected in 2019 by the Open Space Authority and the city of San Jose. So really important piece of the puzzle here as we think long-term about the solutions. The Monterey Road corridor is also the planned route of the California high-speed rail. So thinking about this all together, through the planning process as an important feature to address through restoration. And then if you would please click once more. In addition to Monterey Road, we have all these other roads. And so when I just a few moments ago was alluding to continuing study, we know Monterey Road is an issue. We have conceptual ideas for how to make that safer for wildlife and drivers. But we need to build on that understanding for these other roads and figure out what the conservation approach is there. Next slide, please. So at least on Monterey Road and potentially in other locations, we know that there's a need for dedicated wildlife crossing structures. So what we see here are examples of what some call an undercrossing or an underpass feature on the left in Oregon, and then on the right is an overpass or a land bridge that was constructed in Wyoming. So these are tested and proven concepts that are very effective, and we know that at least in the case of Monterey Road, these are part of the puzzle that we need to implement moving forward. Next slide, please. And so we've continuing study going on even as we speak. So in just a moment, we'll check out a short clip from a study that's underway that we're conducting with the Santa Clara Valley Habitat Agency and Pathways for Wildlife. And so this is a bobcat watching the traffic go by on Santa Teresa Boulevard. So if you wouldn't mind playing that. And maybe we'll play it one more time. How about it? So this is a study where we'll understand where wildlife are finding safe passage, where there are problem areas. So similarly to studies that have been previously done and led to our understanding of Monterey Road, this is what we're now employing on Santa Teresa Boulevard and Bailey Avenue as inputs to the planning process as we think about this landscape together. Next slide, please. So I'll wrap here just to celebrate that we're at this point in time where we're building upon the great progress made to conserve those key properties in the valley floor. And now we're here kicking off the Coyote Valley planning process as such an exciting milestone and a turning point to be able to look at this landscape holistically, assess those opportunities and needs all together in context, and then chart that course forward to support wildlife and in turn, the integrity of the ecosystem. Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Neal. So we are still trying to work out our Q&A function. So please bear with us with that, folks. Actually, if you have any questions that are coming to mind, you can go ahead and email them to info@openspaceauthority.org. And if we don't get them today, we'll get back to you as soon as we can. But Neal, I do have a few questions for you and your presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and ask those questions. And the first one that I have is, you hear the terms wildlife corridor and wildlife linkage get thrown around a lot. What's the difference between those two terms, or is there a difference that we should know about?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for asking. And I think the bottom line from my perspective is it's great anybody who's thinking about and working on connectivity. So wildlife corridor, wildlife linkage, all things considered might be a bit semantic or esoteric. And I think the important thing is that this is about connectivity. And it's not so much that we're trying to create wildlife corridors or create wildlife linkages. I prefer to invert or suggest to invert the perspective, because this is a landscape where there has been so much habitat loss and fragmentation that we're really talking about conserving what's left. Getting back to that idea of that life support system, the connective thread, and also how it looks different for different species. So I think that through one lens, Coyote Valley might look like an expansive area. And is all of this really needed to conserve connectivity? If you invert the perspective, you might think, well, this is all that's left in a landscape that has been almost entirely converted to other uses. So it's a meaningful exercise, especially as we think about the needs of the different species and the bottom line, which is they need enough room to live their lives, and the way they live their lives looks different from species to species, and it's all about the interconnected relationships they have.
Awesome, thanks. And we're just getting started here and trying to figure out how we build stronger connections across Coyote Valley. Are there any places that we should be looking at as precedents or examples around the country, around the world, for doing it right and helping wildlife make that connection between the mountain ranges?
Yeah, there are some great connections throughout the American West and on the West Coast. One of the examples that comes to mind is the I-90 corridor through Snoqualmie Pass in Washington, a really great effort to connect large protected areas. And because there's a highway going through there, there's an excellent array of structures, some over, some under, some wet, some dry, because different species have different preferences. Wildlife crossings are important, and so other places, whether it's Wyoming, whether it's Utah, whether it's Arizona, there are great examples to draw from. There's some work underway in California on wildlife crossing structures, and I think the other piece that, among unique and special elements about Coyote Valley is the proximity to the urban centers of San Jose. So it creates a really excellent opportunity for us to really connect with this place as people and think about the richness of life that rely on it. And so at least in my mind, what that equates to is great enthusiasm and excitement to think about how we can restore habitats and give these wildlife what they need to thrive, because in turn, healthy environment, of course, that's going to help us as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Neal. Really appreciate your time and joining us today. I think we'll go ahead and go to our next speaker, but thanks again, Neal. So I'm happy to now introduce from the Wildlife Education Rehabilitation Center, Anna Pascual. Today, Anna's going to talk to us about some of the birds found in Coyote Valley, some bird watching tips, and she's even going to bring out a very special guest for us all to meet. If you have any questions for Anna, again, send them via email to info@openspaceauthority.org, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. But with that, I am going to welcome Anna to turn on her camera and start to chat with us.
Can you hear me? It looks like you have to control the video.
Okay, we can hear you. Can we get some technical help with turning on Anna's video?
Yeah, it says the host has to start my video.
There we go. Hey,
all right.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you guys too.
I'm going to go off camera and let everyone just see you and who you're going to introduce us to. So I'll see you later.
All right, sounds good. All right, hi everybody. My name is Anna and I am with WERC, the Wildlife Education and Rehabilitation Center in Morgan Hill, California. And what we do, our main mission here is to take in sick, injured, and orphaned native wildlife and release them back out into the wild where they belong. Sometimes though, we do get animals in that do have injuries to them that if we were to release them back out into the wild, they would not survive very well on their own. So we keep them as residential animals. So we're able to take them out to events or do programs such as this. So you guys get to see animals up close and personal. So we deal with local wildlife. And I know from the last presenter, you guys have seen that there's a wide variety of animals that call Coyote Valley home, which is why it's so important to have places like Open Space Authority who help keep land open from being built up so these animals have a habitat, because they play a very important role in Coyote Valley. And again, Coyote Valley plays a very important role with wild animals. So the animal that ambassador that I brought out to share with you guys today, you might see her flopping around off the screen a little bit. This is Eureka, and Eureka is a yellow-billed magpie. She is playing around with her feet a little bit because she's used to being loose in her enclosure where she's flying around. She's like, why am I stuck here on your hand? I want to go fly up into a tree. So don't mind her. Also, what you might notice when you first see her is around her eyes might look a little bit strange. She's missing some feathers. She's actually going through a molt right now. She had to wait right before we were going to come on and do this program to start going through a molt. So what a molt is birds will actually lose feathers and fresh new feathers grow in. There are some species such as a lot of the corvids, which are crows, jays, magpies. These guys, it seems with her, it's every other year. She'll actually lose almost all the feathers on her head, so she can look a little bit silly. So this unfortunately is one of her little silly molts, so that's excuse the way that her eyes kind of look. But the reason why I chose her to bring her out to share with you guys is because how special these birds are. to Coyote Valley, to California in general, because this is the only place that you will find them. These guys are endemic to California. Across part of the rest of the United States, they have the black-billed variety. So you can imagine they look very similar, except the beak is a different color. Personally, I think the yellow just is very striking on these birds. So if you go out to some of the open space preserves like in Coyote Valley or go hiking, keep an eye out. You might take for granted if you see these magpies around, not realizing how special it is that you are seeing them. Because like I said, these guys are just endemic, so they're only found here, and it's also small pockets in California. So it's not all of California. So you can find them up in Gilroy, all the way down. She actually came from Santa Barbara. So how we got her and why she's not out in the wild is when she was young, she was in a nest and some raccoons, unfortunately, they are a predator, got in and killed her entire family. She was a lone survivor. Luckily, somebody found her, was able to save her. She went to a wildlife center down in Santa Barbara. These guys are very intelligent, very smart. They live in a family group. So they learn social cues by being around other magpies. They didn't have any other magpies that came in, so they were trying to find a place that could take her because they were afraid that she was getting too used to people since she was such a youngster when she came in, and there was no other magpies to put her with. So she ended up coming up to our center. We tried to reach out, try to find any place that had magpies to put her with. Fortunately, we couldn't find any. We tried to get the wild ones around here to kind of help get her acclimated. But unfortunately, at our center, we do have yellow magpies, but they like to stay farther down the road, and we can't leave her down there safely. So she was getting too used to people. So unfortunately, the decision was made that she was unable to be put back out into the wild. So that's why she goes to these programs so people get to see them up close. Because in the wild, when people notice them, they just see a black and white bird with a yellow beak. But if you really look closely, when the sun hits, she's actually an array of different colors, especially on that tail and the wings. She's got some greens and blues and purples. So these guys are pretty beautiful birds. And how they help Coyote Valley is these guys help seed dispersals. So they'll eat vegetation. They might eat some berries and fly in their fecal matter, poop out some seeds or spit them out. And it's going to help spread the vegetation around. So again, it's a very important role. A lot of birds will do this. They also are a scavenger. So they will be kind of like a cleanup crew. If they find some dead animal somewhere, these guys will clean it up. So again, which helps stop the spread of diseases and also helps break down those bodies to kind of fertilize the soil to make them nice and rich. A lot of other animals do this as well. I'm sure if you go out to Coyote Valley and you look up in the sky, one of the most common birds that you will see up there or flying around in the sky is actually turkey vultures, a very common bird. And how you can identify them is usually you'll see them in more than one. You'll see them in groups. You could see them singularly, but when they fly, they make a V shape with their wings and they kind of tip back and forth and kind of fly in a circle. If the wings are flat, you might be looking at a hawk or even eagles. We do have bald eagles and golden eagles around as well. So we encourage you guys to kind of go out, take a look at all the different variety of wildlife, and again, know how Coyote Valley, helps these animals by giving them a habitat, and how these animals help by seed dispersals. They're seed eaters, again, scavengers like that turkey vulture, help stop the diseases. And a lot of the birds of prey kind of help control prey species so that population doesn't get out of control. So there's a lot of different variety of birds. You just got to keep your eyes open. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. That's great. And thank you, Eureka. What a beautiful bird, and the colors that you mentioned. So cool to see that up close. Really appreciate that. A few questions for you. So if we want to go out into Coyote Valley or one of the preserves up in the hills, what would be the best time of the day to find a bird like a yellow-billed magpie?
So yellow-billed magpies are what's called a diurnal bird, so which means they're awake during the daytime. So a lot of times in the mornings and stuff, you'll see them kind of very active because, like I said, these guys do live in groups. You will see them throughout the day, but I tend to see them more kind of in the mornings and kind of early afternoons. Once the sun starts going down, these guys are gonna go find some shelter because, again, they're just going to be more active out during the daytime. You also will see them harassing some of the other birds of prey too, because being a corvid, these guys can be a little bit bullies and they don't like the bigger birds in their territory. So again, you can keep a lookout for that. Usually when these guys are around, it's quite noticeable. They'll make quite a ruckus.
Great. So another question here. What can we do, like in our own backyards, to make life easier for our local bird population?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things that people can do. One, if you have pets, cats and dogs, because unfortunately, especially during fledgling season, what that means is when birds hatch, and they're in the nest, they'll develop their feathers. And there's a time that they're called fledglings where they actually will be on the ground. The same thing with these magpies, they'll be on the ground, but they're unable to fly. So one of the biggest dangers, is cats coming and getting them because they're easy prey. And, if they happen to be in someone's backyard, dogs can get them as well. So what we always recommend people doing is, one, if you can, contain the animals, but I know that's hard a lot of times with cats, a lot of feral cats and stuff. But also if you feed your animals outside, kind of keep in a place, because these guys, like I said, they pretty much eat everything. They're being scavengers. They can go after the, cat and dog food as well. So you don't really want to attract them into your yard if you do have these animals out there. So you want them more in places like Coyote Valley, where there's, more natural predators out there. It's not, cats and dogs. So, in your yard, I would just personally recommend just looking at their beauty as opposed to interfering and putting food out and stuff for them, because that will artificially attract them there and it can actually put their lives in danger.
Good to know. How about things like bird baths?
Oh, bird baths. Those are, a good source of them to get, water. They will bathe in them. So yeah, water is probably more important than food, because we rather them be out finding their own food, eat scavenging, helping stop the spread of disease, spreading seeds around to help, our ecosystem, as opposed to giving them food that, it wouldn't naturally be out there. So a bird bath, having a water source is great for wildlife, just to give them that water source, because, we're always seem to be in a drought. So, water is always helpful for these animals.
Got it. Good to know. So we actually have a comment from Craig, who's watching out there. He sent us a note saying that he counted 99 yellow-billed magpies a couple years ago at the Coyote Valley Open Space Preserve parking lot. So I wanted to ask, are there any tools or resources you'd recommend for identifying birds, or tips for looking them up later?
So there are some wonderful apps too. I know there's one called Merlin, stuff you can get on your phone, and you can kind of, you see a bird, it will ask you some questions about it, and you kind of click it in there. I mean, they're not 100% accurate or whatnot, but there's also birding books. Siblings has a really great one. And the thing I find fascinating is in a lot of bird books, you'll notice they're not photographs of birds for identification, but they're drawings. And the reason why they do drawings as opposed to photographs is because it's really hard sometimes to catch. Like the magpie, like I said, with these beautiful colors, if you took a picture of her, she'd probably just look black and white. But it makes these patterns kind of stand out. So it's really, unless you have either the app, if you're out there and you have reception, you can look it up that way, or there's a lot of great birding books and stuff to help you identify. And like I mentioned with the vultures, you can tell them apart versus hawks. We have the red-tailed hawks, the beautiful, rusty red tail. But animals go through phases too, depending on how old they are. So you might see a hawk flying around and doesn't have a red tail. Doesn't mean it's not one, because they don't get their red tail till they're about 2 years old. So that's what can make bird identification a little bit tricky, is just because they can look different at different stages of their life.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Anna. And the bird's name was Eureka, right?
Correct. We named her Eureka because we wanted something uniquely California, and since that's our motto, we figured Eureka fit her quite well.
Got it. Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Eureka. Really appreciate your time and all the information you shared with us. And I think we'll go on to our next speaker now.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Thanks. So now I'd like to welcome our next speaker as we say goodbye to Eureka and Anna. And now that we've learned some of the tricks and tips for spotting birds in Coyote Valley, we're going to meet a group that's working to study the health of bird populations in the Bay Area. It's my pleasure to introduce Katie LaBarbera and Sirena Lau from the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, an organization that has received funding through the authority's Urban Space Grant Program. Katie and Sirena are here to talk to us about how their organization is working with local schools to study how birds are using Coyote Valley as a wildlife corridor. Again, if you have questions, email them to info@openspaceauthority.org and we'll get to them either today or after the webinar. But with that, I will turn it over to Katie and Sirena.
Thanks so much, Nick. Hi, so we are from San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, which, as Nick mentioned, works to preserve bird populations and their habitats through science and outreach. I specifically work primarily at the Coyote Creek field station, which is a place where we band birds. So that's how you end up with a bird in your hand. You might be wondering, this lovely yellow bird. This is a Wilson's warbler. We catch the birds and we put individually numbered metal bands on their legs. They're very light bands so that they don't impact the bird's activity in any way. But this way, if we or anyone else catches the bird again, they can look up that number and see exactly which individual bird that is. This is a procedure that happens all over the world, this bird banding, and it's used to study things like bird migration, the size of populations, how well they're reproducing, how they're being impacted by things like fires and drought. So this is an ongoing scientific process. At Coyote Creek Field Station has been banding birds for more than 30 years. And what I'd like to talk to you a bit about today is why you might either band birds in the same place for 30 years, or maybe go out and bird the same place like Coyote Valley for many years, why it can still be interesting to stay in the same place and watch the birds. So if you could give me the next slide. This is just to orient you a bit. So this map on the left here, right at the bottom of the map, you see Coyote Valley Open Space Preserve is that yellow dot. You can see that Coyote Creek in blue there is just a little bit down the valley. So Coyote Creek, of course, is at the bottom of Coyote Valley. If you follow that north or downstream toward the bay, you will eventually get to another yellow dot, and that is our Coyote Creek field station. So we're right by the bay, but we are connected to Coyote Valley Open Space Preserve by Coyote Creek, and we're within this general valley area. As our previous speaker talked about wildlife corridors and wildlife moving around, wildlife do like to move along the creek. So you do get very similar wildlife along these 2 points in the creek. On the right, you just see a little bit of a zoomed in area to our Coyote Creek field station. It looks pretty small, those 2 little strips of green and then a little strip of grass in the middle. You would be amazed how many birds fit in just those little patches of green. And so if you look at that and you think about how you can't even really see that on the big map, and then you look down where Coyote Valley Open Space Preserve is, and you can see those patches of green, the amount of birds in there is just proportionally really amazing. Next slide, please. These are 3 species that you might commonly see in Coyote Valley. They are also species that we get at the field station. On the left, we have the ash-throated flycatcher. This is a pretty large bird that flies out and catches bugs in midair. In the middle, we have the ruby-crowned kinglet, which is a very small bird that flits around among leaves and picks insects off of leaves. The males have this nice ruby crown, although they often hide it and only bring it out when they're angry. And then on the right is the white-breasted nuthatch, which is a sort of medium small bird that runs around and picks bugs off of bark and likes to be upside down a lot. These are all birds that you could see in Coyote Valley, but you would be extremely lucky if you saw them all at one time. So if you look at the bar charts on the bottom there, these are the sightings of these birds at Coyote Valley Open Space Preserve over the months of the year. So beginning with January and then going to December. And the larger the green bar is, the more commonly they are seen. And if there's no green bar, you do not see that bird at that time. Looking at the bottom, the white-breasted nuthatch can be seen pretty much year-round. They're just always there. But the ruby-crowned kinglet and the ash-throated flycatcher have almost inverse presences over time. So the ash-throated flycatcher is appearing around April and pretty much disappearing by right about now. So this is a bird that is here during the bird breeding season. The ruby-crowned kinglet is showing up right about now, mid-September, and hanging out until April, and then taking off. So if you go and bird Coyote Valley, say once a month for a year, you will see these birds in these different patterns. So you will see the ash-throated flycatcher for a while, and then you will see the ruby-crowned kinglet, and then you will see the ash-throated flycatcher again. And we see that also at Coyote Creek. The reason that you're seeing these changes in bird presence is because the birds are doing massive movements over time. So here we've zoomed out quite a lot to look at the ash-throated flycatcher's presence across North America at two different time periods. So on the left, that's June and July, so that's their breeding season. And on the right, we have December to February, so the winter, so not the breeding season. Darker purple means more birds spotted. And you can see that these birds are right all over California and even up to just barely into Canada in the breeding season. They're breeding at that point, but they then migrate south and spend the winter further south. And it would be quite unusual for you to see one in the winter. Next slide, please. The ruby-crowned kinglet is doing almost the opposite. So in the breeding season, the ruby-crowned kinglet is going up far north to breed. And then in the winter, it's coming down and wintering here with us. These are just two static shots, but imagine them moving, right? So the birds all flow up north in the breeding season and then flow down south for the winter, back and forth. And if you're staying in one place like Coyote Valley and watching the birds, I like to think about it as if you're standing on the beach and these waves are coming past you and then receding and coming past you and receding. And so you're in one place, but you can still sense these movements all around you as the birds go back and forth. Next slide, please. And you will see, I gave you sort of three example birds. I didn't show the nuthatch's movements because they don't really move, they just hang out. But all of the species that you're going to see are doing some version of one of these movement patterns, whether that be staying put or migrating at different times, migrating further south or further north. This is a collage of some of our most common birds we catch at the banding station. These are also common birds that you would see in Coyote Valley. And when you sum all these birds up, all of their movements, you get just incredibly massive movements of birds around California. So just as a semi-random example, last week I looked up the number of birds that were expected to be migrating over California on September 10th. And it was based on our scientific understanding and actually on radar, because they can look at mass bird movements using radar. They predicted that, or not predicted, they calculated that 5.3 million birds were flying over California last week in one night. So yeah, even if you're just going to a single place and repeatedly looking for the birds there, you're going to be directly witnessing and being touched by these massive bird movements. And I'm going to turn it over to Sirena now, I think.
All right, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about our education efforts at Coyote Creek Field Station. And as Katie showed, Coyote Creek Field Station is located in North San Jose, Milpitas area. So it's a very urban area. And so we have opportunities to provide really unique experiences to educate the community and especially youth about birds, conservation, and careers in biology. So we actually bring out student groups and community organizations to Coyote Creek Field Station for banding demonstrations. So people get to learn about the process of bird banding, what it is, why we do it. And they also get to learn directly from scientists and volunteers who've been doing this work. And perhaps the most exciting part is they get to see the birds up close in people's hands. It's a really unique experience and it's a lot of fun for people. Next slide. So in 2017, thanks to Measure Q funds, we were able to develop and expand our education programs there. We developed the Bird Population and Migration Education module, which is a middle school curriculum where students get to learn about the resident and migratory birds that we catch at CCFS and that you would be able to see at Coyote Valley. And the students also get to learn about the data that we've actually collected there. And so when we have funding available, we're able to bring these students to Coyote Creek Field Station, where they get to experience the banding demonstration and see those birds again. And they also get to participate in a hands-on band partner activity where they get to simulate the process of bird banding and collecting data from each other. Next slide. So these are some examples of worksheets that are part of the curriculum. So in these worksheets, students are getting to learn about some of the species that we have highlighted and that we've banded at Coyote Creek Field Station. They get to see the data that we've collected there and graph that data. And importantly, they also get to look at long-term banding data. So I'm sorry, my Roomba is starting. Let me pause that. So as I was saying, importantly, students are getting to also look at the long-term banding data. As Katie mentioned, we've been collecting data at CCFS, Coyote Creek Field Station, for over 30 years. So by looking at this data, students start to understand the importance of long-term data collection and population trends over time for these different species. And all of these worksheets and the lesson plans are available on our website for free for any teacher or educator to use and engage students. And so we've been able to engage over 600 students with this curriculum. Next slide. So here I wanted to share a brief video of an oriole being released after it got banded. And I think this video really captures some of the excitement and engagement that students get from the experience at Coyote Creek Field Station. So if you can play that.
3, 2, 1.
Oh, he doesn't want to leave. No.
And there we are.
So that's one of our favorite parts of the whole process. And as we've mentioned, we've been collecting data at Coyote Creek for over 30 years. And so it's been a huge part of SFBBO's history and our mission. We're a nonprofit dedicated to conserving birds and their habitats through science and outreach. So Coyote Creek Field Station does a lot of that for us. And it's actually SFBBO's 40th year since our inception. So we are actually celebrating with lots of different events and opportunities to support our operations at Coyote Creek Field Station. So if you'd like to learn more about those, visit our website, sfbbo.org. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie and Sirena. I really appreciate that and all the work you're doing out there to get us to help us better understand what's happening with our bird populations in the Bay Area. Some questions that we have for you. In your data collection, have you noticed any impacts of climate change on migratory patterns or any other trends that are starting to emerge?
We are unfortunately seeing a decline over time in the birds that we get that are longer distance migrants. So if you think about those maps, the birds that are flying further between their north and south breeding grounds, their populations are generally decreasing based on our capturing of them at the banding station over time. Our resident birds, the ones that are here year-round, seem to be doing fine, but we are concerned about these migratory birds, and they are also the birds that are more likely to be impacted by our wildfire smoke situation that's been happening. So yeah, we're keeping a pretty close eye on that.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And unfortunate, but it's good that we're tracking this and learning as we go. Is it hard to catch birds for bird banding? Are there any special techniques you need to use?
Well, there's some equipment that you need. We catch them with nets that we put up vertically, and then the birds fly into them. Don't please try this at home. And also you can't, because you have to have several federal and state permits to even purchase these nets. But the idea is they're basically invisible to the birds, and they fly in, and they're very springy and bouncy, so they don't jar the birds or anything. They just sort of catch them and then hold them. And we go and check the nets very often to make sure that we catch the birds as soon as they fly in. It does take a lot of training to learn how to handle a bird safely. People have fortunately been banding birds for long enough that we have a really good protocols for how do you hold a bird and measure it in a way that is extremely safe for the bird and quick and lets you get data and then let the bird go on its way. And that's actually one of our big missions as part of our education is both educating students and community members, but also educating our volunteers who come and bird band with us. So that's really fun, is people come in and don't think they could possibly hold and measure a tiny bird, and they don't think of themselves as scientists, and and then there they are doing it and being scientists. It's great.
Great. Are there any particular species that you're focused on right now because of their status?
Yeah, I mean, we're keeping an eye out for especially our migratory warblers. So the Wilson's warbler, actually, that Sirena was talking about, is a big one. Yellow warbler is another one. We just caught a few of them on Sunday, and I was very happy to see that. We thought we might have one breeding here this summer, which had been a target for the habitat restoration that happened at Coyote Creek about 25 years ago. Was in theory supposed to make it good breeding habitat for the yellow warbler, but that was our first hint that they might actually be showing up. So that was exciting.
And for both of you, do you have a favorite native bird to see, and why? Hard to pick favorites, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Well, I did my PhD on juncos, and so I'm a big fan of juncos. They're very common. We don't catch them at the station so much, but they're a very common backyard and feeder bird. They're brown with these black heads, and they nest on the ground. So if you're doing a lawnmower or raking leaves, keep an eye on the ground.
How about you, Sirena?
It is very hard for me to pick a favorite bird, but since today happens to be Plover Appreciation Day, I want to shout out our snowy plovers. They're a threatened species we have here in the Bay. You probably won't find them. You'd be very lucky to find them probably at Coyote Valley, but they nest on the Bay, and they're threatened. There aren't that many of them left, but we do a lot of work to help protect them.
They're teeny little cotton balls on legs.
Great. So we might have some younger people joining us today in the audience. Do you have any tips or advice on how they might learn more, or opportunities to get involved in this type of work?
I mean, yeah, any kind of basically get outdoors, and if outdoors means a backyard in a residential area, that totally works. I grew up in the middle of Chicago, and I was bird watching pigeons and very urban sparrows, but all animals can teach you information. The apps that were mentioned earlier can be really helpful for learning how to ID birds, and also thinking about collecting data. You can be anywhere and have pretty much any skill level and contribute to these large community science projects that are mapping ranges and population trends. So Merlin is a great one for learning your birds. iNaturalist will help you ID any living thing, including plants and bugs, and that those data are used by scientists. BirdNet is a great one for identifying bird sounds. If you can start learning bird calls, that's a great way to ID birds you can't see. And BirdNet, if you record a call, it will figure out what bird it is. But yeah, just get outside mostly. Sirena, do you have, yeah?
Yeah, and I'll also note that Merlin also does that now too, the bird sound identification.
Cool.
So another point for Merlin there for bird ID. And then, yeah, I would say also just if you start to get interested in birds, definitely share that love with people, just to spread bird fever, get people to appreciate birds, and because people will only protect what they care about, right? The things that they know about. And again, you're also welcome to visit our website for opportunities for kids to be involved. We often do events for the public. And there are lots of community groups throughout the Bay Area that do programs for families, and get kids involved to go see birds and to help birds. So yeah, definitely look up some local resources.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both again for joining us today. Really appreciate your presentation and the answers to those questions. We are almost out of time here, so I think we're going to kind of wrap things up. So thanks again, Katie and Sirena. And let's see, some closing points that I'd like to make as we close out this first webinar. So for all of you who emailed us questions, we are working on getting those answered, and thank you so much for joining us today. We did get one question that I wanted to answer from Carter, who asked about whether that development that was planned for Coyote Valley maybe 5 or 10 years ago between Morgan Hill and San Jose was still taking place. And the answer is that big development proposal is no longer taking place, and we are now focused on the protection of the lands and the open spaces that have been conserved, like that map that I showed at the beginning. So protecting wildlife habitat and creating more wildlife connectivity was the focus of today's presentation, and it's a focus of the upcoming Coyote Valley Conservation Areas Master Plan. But we're also going to be looking at things like public access and the role that people and agencies play as stewards of the land and are important outcomes of the master planning process. So we hope you will join us for our next webinar in the series, taking place at the same time next Thursday, September 23rd, to learn about the past, present, and future of land stewardship in Coyote Valley. I want to note that for thousands of years, local tribes have stewarded what we now call Coyote Valley, and today their strong stewardship ethic of respecting the land and all its natural inhabitants continues. And we are very honored that we'll have representatives from the Mwekma Ohlone tribe join us at our next webinar to share their story and what Coyote Valley means to them. We'll also be joined by my colleague here at the Open Space Authority, Jake Smith, and Zoe Diggory from Valley Water, who will share their story, share the story of the past, present, and future of stewarding Coyote Valley's unique water resources. So please keep an eye out for our follow-up email next Tuesday, where we will send you a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as information on how to register for the next webinar if you're not already signed up. And with that, I will say thank you again to all our wonderful speakers for your time and for the information you shared with us today. And thank you all for joining us. And we really hope we'll see you at the next couple webinars, and hope you have a great day.